On the morning of June 6, 1944, German Field Marshal von Rundstedt received a phone call that would shatter everything Hitler had promised. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress Europe that took 3 years and billions of reichsmarks to build, had been breached in less than an hour. But what he said next was not what anyone expected. Before we reveal those shocking words, hit that subscribe button, because this story goes deeper than any history book dares to tell. And you won't believe what really happened behind closed doors in those first chaotic hours. 3 years earlier, in 1941, Adolf Hitler stood on the windswept coast of France and declared his vision. He swept his arm across the horizon where grey Atlantic waves crashed against rocky shores and said these beaches would become Germany's impenetrable shield. The Atlantic Wall would stretch from Norway to Spain, a continuous fortress of concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, and artillery positions that would make invasion impossible. It was not just military engineering. It was a statement to the world. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the aging Prussian aristocrat with ice in his veins and skepticism in his heart, listened to Hitler's grand proclamation and said nothing. Von Rundstedt had commanded armies when Hitler was still a corporal. He understood warfare in ways the Führer never would. But he also understood something more dangerous. You did not contradict Hitler and keep your command. So he nodded and began the impossible task of defending 3,000 miles of coastline with divisions that were increasingly stripped away for the Eastern Front. By 1944, the Atlantic Wall existed in 2 versions. The propaganda version showed impenetrable fortifications manned by elite troops with unlimited ammunition and clear sight lines, across kill zones where any invader would be cut to pieces. Newsreels showed German soldiers confidently manning massive artillery pieces, while officers studied maps with the calm certainty of men who held every advantage. The real Atlantic Wall was something else entirely. Von Rundstedt knew the truth. He had inherited a Frankenstein's monster of coastal defenses, a patchwork of strongpoints separated by gaps, miles wide where only barbed wire and the occasional patrol stood between Germany and catastrophe. The divisions manning these positions were not elite troops. They were a mixture of teenagers too young for the Russian front, men too old or injured for frontline combat, and conscripts from occupied territories who had no desire to die for Germany. Then there was Rommel. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, Hitler's favorite general, arrived in early 1944 to take command of Army Group B and inspect the very beaches where the Allies were most likely to land. Rommel brought with him the prestige of his victories in North Africa and an energy that made every officer in his presence stand straighter. He also brought a fundamental disagreement with von Rundstedt that would doom Germany's defense before the first Allied soldier touched French soil. Von Rundstedt believed in mobile defense. Let the Allies land, he argued. Let them establish their beachhead, then hit them with massed panzer divisions in a devastating counterattack that would drive them back into the sea. It was classical warfare, the kind of strategy that had won battles for centuries. Hold your reserves, identify the enemy's main effort, and strike with overwhelming force at the decisive point. Rommel had seen the future of warfare in the African desert, where Allied aircraft controlled the skies and turned any German movement in daylight into a suicide mission. He understood that the old rules no longer applied. The invasion, Rommel insisted, had to be stopped at the waterline. Every panzer division, every artillery piece, every man needed to be close enough to the beaches to intervene within the first hours. because after the Allies established air superiority, moving anything larger than a bicycle in daylight would be impossible, they argued. They sent reports to Hitler. They waited for a decision. Hitler, in his supreme wisdom, split the difference and satisfied no one. Some panzer divisions went to Rommel near the coast. Others stayed in reserve under von Rundstedt's command. But the most critical armored formations remained under Hitler's personal control, requiring his direct approval before they could move. It was a compromise that guaranteed disaster. By late May 1944, Rommel inspected the beaches one last time and wrote in his diary with rare optimism, "I am more confident than ever before. If the British give us just 2 more weeks, I won't have any more doubt about it. 2 more weeks to lay more mines, to pour more concrete, to position more obstacles in the surf. 2 more weeks to turn Hitler's propaganda vision into something." Approaching reality, Rommel would not get his 2 weeks. Phone rang at von Rundstedt's headquarters at 630 hours on June 6, 1944. The voice on the other end belonged to a junior staff officer whose words tumbled out in barely controlled panic. Paratroopers had landed behind the beaches. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula. British paratroopers had seized crucial bridges, and now in the grey dawn light, the channel was filled with ships. Thousands of ships. Von Rundstedt's first response was not shock or fear. It was frustration. The old Field Marshal had been expecting this call for months. Every intelligence report, every reconnaissance flight, every decoded signal had pointed to an invasion in June. The tides were right. The moon was right. The weather, despite the storms of the previous days, was clearing just enough. And yet Hitler and his yes-men at OKW had convinced themselves the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the channel, where the fortifications were strongest. "Where is Rommel?" von Rundstedt asked. The answer made everything worse. Rommel was in Germany. The Desert Fox had gone home to celebrate his wife's birthday and to personally lobby Hitler for more resources. The man whose entire strategy depended on immediate, violent counterattack in the first hours of invasion was 200 miles away, about to receive a phone call that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Von Rundstedt immediately ordered the panzer divisions under his command to move toward Normandy. But he needed more. He needed the panzer reserves that only Hitler could authorize. He needed them moving now, this instant, before Allied air power made movement impossible. His staff officers placed the call to OKW, to the Führer S headquarters where Hitler's military high command managed the war through a combination of wishful thinking and terror of their master's rage. The response came back within the hour. Hitler was still asleep. No one dared wake him. The panzer reserves would remain in place until the Führer personally assessed the situation. After all, this might be a diversion. The real invasion could still be coming at Pas-de-Calais. Von Rundstedt, the old Prussian who had maintained iron composure through years of war, allowed himself a moment of pure rage. Then he did something that subordinates would whisper about in the days to come. He called his old friend, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, at OKW, and said with perfect, cutting clarity, "If we are not allowed to move the panzers immediately, then perhaps you should make peace, you fools." The words hung in the air. In Hitler's Germany, such defeatism could earn a bullet. Von Rundstedt did not care. He had just watched 3 years of preparation. become meaningless because the man responsible for defending Europe against invasion could not be awakened. On the beaches, the Atlantic Wall was dying in real time. At Omaha Beach, American forces were being cut to pieces by German defenders in bunkers that Allied intelligence had somehow missed. The Americans were trapped against the seawall, taking horrific casualties. And for a few hours it looked like Rommel's nightmares might come true in reverse. The Allies might actually be thrown back into the sea. But even as German commanders at Omaha allowed themselves to hope, the reports from other beaches told a different story. At Utah Beach, the Americans had landed in the wrong place due to strong currents, but that accident had saved them. They hit a lightly defended section of coast and were pouring inland with minimal casualties. At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, British and Canadian forces were pushing through the defenses with a combination of specialized armor and overwhelming firepower that the German defenders had never encountered. The Atlantic Wall, that monument to Hitler's certainty, was not stopping the invasion. It was barely slowing it down. Rommel received his phone call at home and immediately began the race back to Normandy. His driver pushed their staff car to dangerous speeds on French roads while Rommel sat in silence, calculating, understanding that every minute he was absent was a minute the Allies were consolidating their foothold. When he finally reached his headquarters that evening, the reports confirmed his worst fears. The Allies were ashore. They had broken through the beach defenses, and the panzer divisions that could have made a difference in the first hours were still waiting for Hitler's permission to move. Words to his staff that night were recorded by his aide, and they contained no false optimism. Our friends from the Navy and the Luftwaffe are not going to help us much in this business. It's the same old story. The Allies have complete air superiority. They have smashed our radar. We are fighting blind. But then he added something that showed the Desert Fox still believed in German military prowess. We must throw them back into the sea. This is not just an invasion. This is the war. Everything depends on the next 48 hours. By June 7th, the second day of the invasion, the full scope of the catastrophe was becoming clear to every German commander in Normandy. The Allies had landed nearly 170,000 men across 5 beaches. They had secured a continuous beachhead 25 miles wide and varying depths. And most critically, they were expanding that beachhead faster than German reinforcements could arrive to contain it. Hitler finally authorized the movement of panzer reserves on the evening of June 6th, a full 12 hours after von Rundstedt had requested them. Those 12 hours would prove decisive. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, one of Germany's elite formations composed of fanatical teenage soldiers from the Hitler Youth, began moving toward the invasion beaches. They moved at night to avoid Allied aircraft. They hid in forests during daylight. A journey that should have taken 6 hours took nearly 2 days. When they finally arrived and launched their counterattack on June 7th, they fought with suicidal bravery and achieved nothing decisive. Allied naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers offshore could reach 10 miles inland when German panzers massed for attack. Forward observers called in naval artillery that turned armored formations into burning wrecks. The teenagers of the Hitlerjugend division died in their tanks, achieving local victories that meant nothing in the larger collapse of the German position. Von Rundstedt watched the reports flow into his headquarters and understood that the battle for the beaches was already lost. The question now was whether Germany could contain the breakout, hold the Allies in Normandy long enough to bleed them white, and perhaps negotiate some kind of settlement before the entire Western Front collapsed. It was the strategy of a man who understood military reality but was trapped in a political system where reality was whatever Hitler declared it to be. On June 11th, Hitler summoned both von Rundstedt and Rommel to a conference. They flew to Germany, to a bunker complex where Hitler held court surrounded by sycophants and maps that showed a fantasy version of the war. Von Rundstedt and Rommel presented their assessment. The Atlantic Wall had failed. The Allies were ashore in strength, and Germany needed to withdraw from forward positions in Normandy to establish a more defensible line further inland. Hitler's response was pure rage. There would be no retreat. Every inch of ground would be held. The V-weapon campaign against England would turn the tide. New jet fighters were coming that would sweep the Allies from the sky. Secret weapons would change everything, and the field marshals needed to show more offensive spirit. Von Rundstedt left that meeting knowing he was watching the leadership of a madman. According to witnesses, his comment to his staff was devastatingly simple: "The man has lost his mind." Rommel, still believing he could salvage something from the disaster, threw himself into organizing a new defensive line. But every decision had to be approved by Hitler. Every tactical retreat had to be justified to a man thousands of miles away who understood nothing about the situation. And every day, Allied strength grew while German forces were ground down in pointless local counterattacks that achieved nothing except more dead Germans. By the end of June, the British launched Operation Epsom, an attempt to encircle the city of Caen and break out of the Normandy beachhead. The operation failed to achieve its objectives, but it revealed something worse to the German commanders. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to simply survive another day. General Georg von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West, recognized the futility earlier than most. He began advocating for a fighting withdrawal into the French interior, a mobile defense, where German armor could use its training and capabilities instead of being pinned down as static artillery. His reward for this realism was immediate dismissal. He was sacked on July 1st and replaced with a more compliant officer, von Rundstedt. Watching another competent general removed for telling the truth made his move. On July 2nd, he sent a formal report to OKW outlining the situation in Normandy with brutal honesty. The Atlantic Wall had failed. The Allied lodgment was permanent. German forces were taking unsustainable casualties. The front could not be held indefinitely. Something had to change. Field Marshal Keitel called him back with a question that perfectly captured the insanity of Hitler's military leadership. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" Von Rundstedt's response became legendary in German military circles. With the dry sarcasm of a man who had nothing left to lose, he replied, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" That conversation was his last as Supreme Commander West. Within hours, he was ordered to retire for health reasons. His replacement was Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, a competent officer who Hitler believed would show more fighting spirit. Von Kluge arrived in Normandy full of confidence that the situation had been exaggerated. Within weeks, he was sending the exact same reports as von Rundstedt, begging for permission to withdraw, and realizing he was trapped in the same impossible situation. Rommel continued fighting through July, trying to hold together a front that was dissolving day by day. His faith in German military excellence sustained him, even as the evidence mounted that excellence was not enough against overwhelming material superiority and complete air dominance. He visited frontline units constantly, appearing in muddy trenches and bombed-out command posts, trying through sheer force of personality to will his troops to hold. On July 17th, Rommel was driving back from a frontline inspection when Allied fighter aircraft spotted his staff car. The fighters strafed the road. Rommel's driver was killed. The car crashed. Rommel was thrown against the windshield, suffering severe head injuries. He was evacuated to a hospital in Germany, effectively ending his participation in the Normandy campaign. But by then Rommel had already crossed a line that would prove fatal. In the preceding weeks, he had been approached by members of the German resistance movement who were planning to assassinate Hitler. The conspirators needed the support of a field marshal with the prestige to lead Germany after Hitler's death. They needed someone the army would follow. They needed Rommel. The Desert Fox did not actively join the conspiracy, but he did not report it either. He had reached his own conclusion about Hitler and Germany's future. In a letter to one of the conspirators, he wrote that Hitler had to be removed from power, that the war was lost, and that Germany needed to negotiate peace before the country was completely destroyed. These were the words of a man who had finally accepted that military excellence could not overcome political insanity. The July 20th assassination attempt failed. Hitler survived, and in the investigations that followed, Rommel's name surfaced, not as an active plotter, but as a man who knew and did not act. In Hitler's Germany, that was enough for a death sentence. But Hitler understood that putting the famous Desert Fox on trial would be a propaganda disaster. So he offered Rommel a choice: suicide with a state funeral and protection for his family, or a public trial that would end with his execution and reprisals against his wife and son. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at Rommel's home with a vial of poison. He took it in the back seat of their staff car and was dead within minutes. The German public was told he had died from injuries sustained in the air attack on July 17th. The Field Marshal who had believed Germany could win right up until the moment the Atlantic Wall failed received a hero's burial with full military honors. Von Rundstedt was brought out of retirement to deliver the eulogy. The American breakout came in late July with Operation Cobra. After weeks of grinding attritional warfare, American forces finally punched through the German lines west of Saint-Lay. The breach turned into a flood. American armored divisions poured through the gap, racing south and east, cutting off entire German formations. The Atlantic Wall, which was supposed to stop the invasion at the beaches, was now hundreds of miles in the rear, its guns pointing uselessly at empty ocean. General Friedrich Ullmann, commander of the German 7th Army, watched his command disintegrate. His units were encircled. His supply lines were cut. His requests for permission to withdraw were denied by Hitler. On June 29th, before the full extent of the disaster became clear, Ullmann died. The official cause was listed as a heart attack. Many historians believe it was suicide. The general could not face watching his army be destroyed because Hitler refused to accept military reality. By August, the remainder of the German forces in Normandy were trapped in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. Allied forces had encircled them on three sides. The only escape route was a narrow gap that was under constant artillery fire and air attack. Hitler finally authorized withdrawal, but only after it was nearly too late. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were captured in the pocket. Thousands more were killed trying to escape. The equipment losses were catastrophic. Tanks, artillery, trucks, all abandoned in fields that became graveyards of German military power. Von Kluge, who had replaced von Rundstedt, and who had spent July sending increasingly desperate reports to Hitler about the impossibility of the situation, was himself relieved of command in Madrid. On his way back to Germany to face questions about his connections to the July 20th plotters, He stopped his convoy and took a cyanide capsule. Another Field Marshal dead. Another man who could not reconcile what Hitler demanded with what military reality allowed. The Atlantic Wall. That 3-year project that consumed billions of reichsmarks and the labor of thousands of workers had lasted approximately 6 hours as an effective defensive line. By the end of D-Day, Allied forces had penetrated or bypassed the fortifications at every beach except Omaha. By the end of the first week, the wall was irrelevant. By the end of the summer, it was a historical footnote, a cautionary tale about the difference between propaganda and military effectiveness. But beyond the official reports and sanitized histories, there exists accounts of what German commanders actually said in those desperate hours and days after the invasion. These moments, recorded in diaries, in post-war interviews, and in testimony at various tribunals, reveal men grappling with the collapse of everything they had believed. General Hans Spee, Rommel's chief of staff, recorded a conversation from June 7th, where Rommel, after reviewing the latest reports, turned to his staff and said, "I have been wrong about many things in this war. But I was right about this. We have lost the war in the West. It is only a matter of time now." This from a man who less than 2 weeks earlier had written with confidence about stopping the invasion. Von Rundstedt, in his post-war interrogations, was asked why the Atlantic Wall failed so completely. His response showed the strategic clarity that had made him one of Germany's most respected commanders. The wall never had a chance of stopping a determined invasion backed by air superiority and naval gunfire. What it could have done, what it should have done, was delay the invasion long enough for our mobile reserves to counterattack. But Hitler's interference made even that impossible. He wanted a wall. What he needed was a strategy. One of the most revealing accounts comes from a junior officer in the 716th Infantry Division, which was defending the Normandy beaches on D-Day. In his diary, recovered after the war, he described the moment the naval bombardment began. The world was ending. That is what it felt like. The concrete walls of our bunker shook. Dust filled the air so we could barely breathe. The noise was beyond description. And we understood in that moment that all the training, all the inspections, all the Führer's promises about our invincibility meant nothing. We were mice waiting for the hammer to fall. That sense of betrayal, of having been lied to about the strength of the defenses, appears repeatedly in German accounts. Soldiers who had been told the Atlantic Wall was impregnable watched it crumble in hours. Officers who had been assured they would have air support saw nothing but Allied aircraft. Commanders who believed they would have the reserves to counterattack watched those reserves stall 50 miles from the front because Hitler would not give permission to move. There is also a recording, made by British intelligence from a tapped phone line, of a conversation between 2 captured German officers in late June. The recording captures their shock. "Have you seen the equipment these allies have? Every sergeant has binoculars, better than our generals. They have trucks for everything. They have air support that arrives in minutes. And we are told to stop them with outdated guns and foreign conscripts who do not even speak German. It is insane." Perhaps the most haunting account comes from a conversation von Rundstedt had with a visiting staff officer from OKW in mid-June. The officer, still imbued with Hitler's optimism, suggested that the situation could be turned around with a proper aggressive spirit. Von Rundstedt, 70 years old and exhausted from years of trying to fight a war while being micromanaged by a madman, responded, "Tell me, have you been to the front? Have you seen what the Allied air forces do to any unit that moves in daylight? Have you watched our best divisions be destroyed piece by piece because we are not allowed to conduct mobile warfare? No. Then perhaps you should stop talking about aggressive spirit and start talking about military reality. This war is lost. The only question is how many more of our soldiers have to die before the leadership admits it. What made the failure of the Atlantic Wall even more devastating was that German military intelligence had actually predicted where and when the invasion would come. Throughout May 1944, intelligence reports pointed to Normandy as the likely target. The moon phases, the tides, the weather patterns all suggested early. June. German reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the massive build-up of Allied forces in southern England. Every indicator was there, but Hitler and his inner circle at OKW had convinced themselves that Normandy was impossible, that the Allies would never attack there because it was too far from their ultimate objective of the raw industrial region. They believed the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, and Allied deception operations reinforced that belief. Even after D-Day, even after watching German forces in Normandy being overwhelmed, Hitler and OKW continued to believe that Normandy was a diversion and the real invasion was still coming at Pas de Calais. This strategic blindness had catastrophic consequences. The German 15th Army sat in its positions at Pas de Calais for weeks after D-Day, waiting for an invasion that would never come, while the 7th Army in Normandy was being destroyed. By the time Hitler accepted that Normandy was the real invasion, it was too late to move the 15th Army's divisions effectively. They arrived piecemeal, were thrown into combat without proper coordination, and accomplished nothing except adding to the casualty lists. One German staff officer, in his post-war memoirs, described the command atmosphere in those weeks as watching a man drowning who refuses to grab the rope because he is convinced rescue will come from a different direction. Hitler's certainty overrode every fact, every report, every desperate plea from the front, and men like von Rundstedt and Rommel, who understood what was happening, were powerless to change it. The Atlantic Wall failed not because it was poorly designed or inadequately built, though both were true. It failed because the entire defensive strategy was built on Hitler's assumptions rather than military reality. The wall assumed the Allies would attack where it was strongest. It assumed German air and naval forces would contest the invasion. It assumed panzer reserves would be able to counterattack immediately. And it assumed that German leadership would make rational decisions based on the situation rather than ideology. Every one of those assumptions was wrong, lost in the larger narrative of the Atlantic Wall's failure. Other stories of the ordinary German soldiers who manned the fortifications. These were not the elite SS divisions or hardened Eastern Front veterans. They were coastal defense troops, average age 35, many with previous injuries that made them unfit for frontline combat. They had spent months in concrete bunkers, watching the Atlantic, drilling for an invasion they half believed would never come. When the invasion did come, they fought. At Omaha Beach, the defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division inflicted horrific casualties on the Americans and came close to repelling the landing entirely. They did everything their training had prepared them for. They stayed at their posts under naval bombardment that should have broken any unit. They maintained fire discipline. They called artillery onto the killing zones. And in the end, it was not enough, because they were trying to stop an ocean with a wall made of sand. One survivor of the Omaha Beach defenses, interviewed decades after the war, described the moment he realized they were losing. It was not when the Americans landed. We were killing them. We had them pinned on the beach. It was when I saw American tanks simply drive over our obstacles in the water. They had special tanks, modified to clear the defenses we had spent months building. That is when I understood that the Americans had thought of everything, and we had thought of nothing except following orders. The casualties among the Atlantic Wall's defenders in the first week were catastrophic. Entire battalions simply ceased to exist. Some were overrun by the advancing Allies. Others were surrounded and captured when their orders to hold at all costs prevented any retreat, and some, cut off and abandoned when the mobile warfare phase began, simply disappeared into the chaos of the summer campaign. The commanders felt this weight differently. Von Rundstedt, the aristocratic Prussian, treated it as a strategic problem. He had spent his career commanding armies, and he understood that soldiers died in war. But even he, in his post-war interrogations, showed flashes of anger about the waste. We had good men in those fortifications. They deserved competent leadership. Instead, they got Hitler's fantasies. Rommel personalized it. He visited wounded soldiers in field hospitals. He wrote letters to the families of officers killed under his command. And in his final weeks, before the injuries and the conspiracy and the forced suicide, he spoke repeatedly about the burden of command, of giving orders that you knew would get men killed, of trying to find some tactical advantage that could save a few more lives, even as the strategic situation became hopeless. There is an account, possibly apocryphal, but consistent with Rommel's character, of him visiting a field hospital in early July, a young soldier, no more than 18, dying from wounds sustained in a British artillery barrage. Recognized the Field Marshal. The soldier asked Rommel if they were winning, if his sacrifice meant something. Rommel, the man who had built his reputation on absolute confidence, could not bring himself to lie to a dying boy. He held the soldier's hand and said nothing. The soldier died a few minutes later. Rommel left the hospital and, according to witnesses, sat alone in his staff car for nearly an hour. The Atlantic Wall failed because it was built to fight the wrong war. Hitler imagined a static defense that would shatter any invasion through sheer fortification. His generals knew better but could not override him. The result was a compromise that satisfied no one and guaranteed defeat. Von Rundstedt survived the war, was briefly imprisoned and then released due to age and health. He never wrote memoirs. When journalists asked him about the war, he refused to discuss it in detail. But to friends, in private conversations, he would sometimes talk about June 6, 1944. He would describe that phone call, the desperate attempts to move the panzers, the realization that everything he had tried to build was collapsing. And he would end with the same observation: wars are won by competence, not willpower. Hitler never understood that. The Atlantic Wall, that monument to Hitler's certainty, became after the war a monument to something else entirely: the danger of building military strategy on ideology instead of reality. The bunkers still stand on French beaches, empty concrete shells that tourists photograph. They are reminders that fortifications alone cannot win wars, that leadership matters more than concrete, and that the difference between propaganda and reality is measured in lives. The German commanders who watched the wall fail learned that lesson too late. Von Rundstedt, Rommel, von Kluge, Dolman, they all understood at different speeds that they were fighting in a system where military competence was subordinate to political fantasy. Some, like Dolman and von Kluge, could not bear the weight of that understanding. Others, like Rommel, tried to change it and paid with their lives. And von Rundstedt, the survivor, carried the memory of that June morning for the rest of his life, the phone call, the ships filling the channel, and the moment he understood that everything Hitler had promised was a lie. The Atlantic Wall failed instantly, not because German soldiers lacked courage or German engineers lacked skill. It failed because at the highest levels of command, reality had become negotiable. And in war, reality is never negotiable. It simply arrives, as it did on June 6, 1944, with overwhelming force, and crushes everything built on illusion. That is what the German commanders said when the Atlantic Wall failed. They said the truth, quietly, to each other, in moments of desperate honesty. They said the war was lost. They said their leadership had failed them. They said they had been asked to defend the indefensible with inadequate resources against overwhelming odds. And in the end, the tragedy was not that they said these things too loudly, but that they said them too late, after tens of thousands had already paid the price for strategic blindness at the highest levels. The Atlantic Wall stands today as a memorial not to German strength, but to the fatal consequences of refusing to accept military reality, of building strategy on wishful thinking rather than hard calculation, and of what happens when competent soldiers and commanders are asked to execute impossible missions by leaders who cannot distinguish between propaganda and truth. That lesson, paid for in blood on French beaches in June 1944, remains as relevant now as it was then. History remembers D-Day as an Allied triumph, and it was. But for the Germans who lived through it, who watched the Atlantic Wall crumble in hours and spent the summer watching their armies be destroyed, it was something else, a demonstration that no amount of concrete can compensate for strategic incompetence at the highest levels. Von Rundstedt understood it. Rommel understood it. Even Hitler, in his final days in the bunker, might have understood it. The wall failed because walls always fail when the men behind them are given impossible orders by leaders who have lost touch with reality. That is the lesson, raw and unfiltered, that echoes from those desperate phone calls and whispered conversations in June 1944. Not all fortifications are made of concrete. Some are made of delusion, and those are the ones that collapse fastest.